Greetings, Herle Burlyites. I'm off this week. We've got a lot of work to do to get ready for this imminent election campaign, and the Herle Burly is going to be here with a bunch of different platforms for you to absorb the election through. It's very exciting and it's a lot of work. For this week, for your listening pleasure, we've got Hamish Marshall, who was the campaign manager for the Conservative Party in 2019. This is an old interview in which he reflects on what was learned from that campaign, and it might be pretty interesting as we set up this next one. Enjoy. It's been a hell of a last 17 months, but the good news is Canadians are getting their jabs, patios are open, and people are smiling the kinds of smiles we haven't seen in quite a while. Real smiles, wide smiles, where you can see their teeth. The way we take care of our collective health is something we're rightly proud of in this country. It's not a perfect system, but it's better than most, and the thing is, we're working to make it better. Our presenting sponsor, TELUS, is an important part of that effort. That's never been more apparent than in the last year and a half, where we've all seen just how critical access to digital health resources has become. TELUS Health is Canada's largest and frankly most important IT healthcare provider. They've been investing and innovating in the area for 13 years now. Their purpose is as clear as a perfect high-res MRI file. TELUS Health is focused on helping to change the way Canadians experience healthcare so that everyone, no matter their socioeconomic background, has equal access to it. Just one example. During COVID-19, TELUS mobilized to immediately deliver multiple streams of virtual care technology to nearly 32,000 clinicians across the country. That's a fancy way of teeing up a really important outcome. Canadians could still visit with their doctors, see their test results, and get the treatment they needed, even while isolating at home. We're going to talk more about all this in the coming weeks, including how the expansion of 5G will improve services even more and add about $16 billion to our GDP over the next 20 years. But for now, go to telus.com/health. Today on the pod, as I teased a second ago, I'm excited to welcome Hamish Marshall to the podcast. Welcome, Hamish.
Great to be here.
Hamish is a longtime mover and shaker in conservative political circles. Among many roles, he served in Prime Minister Harper's PMO as manager of strategic planning, and then as pollster in Mr. Harper's successful 2008 federal campaign. He was behind Andrew Scheer's surprise successful run for the Conservative leadership and was also campaign manager for Mr. Scheer in our just completed federal election. We're going to talk to him about that today, why they made the decisions they did, and what might have been gone differently if he had to do it all over again. Hamish Marshall, thanks for being with us on the Herle Burly.
Thanks for having me.
We talked together today as two people who have run successful campaigns and run losing campaigns, and so we know what they're both like.
It's true.
We know how they feel. Before we get into all that, though, can we talk just a little bit about you? Where are you from? Where were you raised? How were you educated? What's your story?
I'm born and raised in Vancouver, BC.
Okay.
Proud British Columbian. I came out to Toronto to do my undergrad at U of T. Messed around in politics. Worked in Queen's Park in the Harris years for a little bit, and then on Parliament Hill in the Canadian Alliance days. Worked for Mr. Harper.
Who were you working for in Canadian Alliance?
Well,
what were you doing in Canadian Alliance?
In the Canadian Alliance, I worked for a guy called Joe Pesci-Solito.
Get out!
And
Joe Pesci-Solito was a young Liberal nemesis of mine in the 1980s.
And he was a Canadian Alliance. Was elected Canadian Alliance MP for Richmond in 2000.
Right.
And then I worked for him until early 2002, when he decided he was going to go switch back to the Liberals.
Right.
And I quit the day he did that and got 8 job offers in a week, which was the sort of best career thing I ever did. And that was certainly a very interesting experience. And I was very gratified to see him lose again on October 21st.
Yeah, that's not the best training ground you could have. First person I worked for was Ralph Goodale. You got Joe Pesci-Solito.
Yeah. And then I ended up going to Oxford and doing an MBA.
Oh, really?
And trying to get out of politics, which I do periodically, and then get dragged back in.
And how do you use your MBA?
Well, I've got a business focuses on helping candidates, clients, and companies get their message out and deal with public affairs problems. So I try to do that. And frankly, a lot of the MBA stuff came in handy when managing a team of, I guess there was about 180 people on the campaign. So there was several days in there I thought, wow, I'm actually using my degree. It's kind of handy.
So you're then a direct competitor of me in the Gandalf group then?
Indeed, yes.
Okay, so this interview is going to go much differently
Okay,
now that I understand
fantastic.
that.
Knives out.
How did you get involved in politics? What inspired you? What motivates you? What are you about in politics?
You know, I grew up in one of those families where if you talked about something, the answer was always get involved. You don't sit back and complain about it. Don't just sit around and say you like what's happening on the TV or you don't like what's happening, get involved. So
Right.
I was always interested in politics for as long as I can remember. And I always had sort of a politically adjacent family. My grandparents were great friends with General George Perks, who was Diefenbaker's Minister of National Defense,
Right.
who had been my grandfather's commanding officer during the war. So my grandmother used to go to 24 Sussex to parties and things back in the Diefenbaker era. And so I always had these stories growing up that they were never really involved in politics, but they were around it. And then that combined with an attitude at home of, well, if you have strong views on something, you should go get involved. So I got involved. I joined the Young Tories my first week in university here at U of T in 1996, and it's kind of just been it's been the source of everything I've done since.
1996, were you more of a provincial Harris Tory or a federal PC Tory?
Yeah, I mean, I was from BC, so I was certainly on at the time I was on the PC side of things. But in 1996 here in Ontario, with the federal right divided, the action was all at the provincial side. So the majority of activism was focused on provincial politics because of the divide federally.
Who's your most admired Canadian politician?
My most admired Canadian politician. My goodness. I don't think I have an answer for that. I don't think there's nobody I idolize or nobody I don't think I have a I don't think I have an answer.
How would you
for that.
describe your relationship with Stephen Harper? He must be somewhat of a mentor to you. You were...
I wouldn't describe him as a mentor. I worked for him at various points. I know him well, or not well. I know him a bit, and I was always sort of one generation behind the people who were in charge in Harper world. So I'm sort of adjacent to a lot of the Harper stuff, but I'm not. I was never closely part of that scene. Patrick Moutart was a mentor of mine. Doug Finley was a mentor of mine.
Okay.
The guys who really got Harper, a huge part in getting Harper elected in 2006 and keeping him there.
Okay. You told me in the back room, just because you said something really interesting to me in the back room, which was that in your spare time you follow British politics. So I don't. And I really don't know what the hell happened over there.
Sure.
We can't spend a lot of time on it. But maybe you could just give us your sense of, was that thing all about Corbyn? Could Labour have beaten Johnson with a different leader, or what was the election about there?
I think it was about two things. I think it was genuinely about Brexit in large parts of the country, but not everywhere, and it was about Corbyn. So I think that the combination of those two things gave Johnson a big majority. I think he could have eked out a much smaller majority if only one of those things had been present. Labour's betrayal of the Leave voters in the northern industrial seats was real and was a big problem for Labour. It was made worse by a terrible leader, and the terrible leader also probably would have cost them the election if they hadn't betrayed their base on Brexit. But the combination of those two has given Johnson a very, very strong majority. And
do you think he's somebody we should have confidence in leadership of that country right now? The world's in my view, kind of a perilous state. I'm looking for good leaders.
Yeah, I think he's one of the most interesting people in politics in the world today. He is a relentlessly positive and optimistic individual who is genuinely focused on the future, and I think that is a very, very good mindset. He's smart. And he's authentic. He leans into his, British eccentric personality in a way that he doesn't apologize for the fact that he's from a rich, influential family and everything else. It's just part of his persona, and he doesn't apologize for it. So I think he is, but because of his persona, he's often, I think, underestimated, especially by people overseas outside of the country. And I think he suffers from a lot of quite unfair comparisons to Trump. Whereas I think he's in a league of his own compared to
different intellectual league.
Very much so, and much more. I think very deliberate in what he does.
Right.
The rap on him is that he's not trustworthy.
Right.
And?
I think he's been consistently, was consistently a Eurosceptic from the beginning. He was in favor of Brexit. He's going to go through it. He's going to deliver it. I think in all these things, the proof is in the pudding, and I think Britain's going to be out of the UK on the 31st of January. So we'll see.
All right. At this point, we're going to take a break to hear from our sponsor. And when we come back, Hamish and I will be talking about the Conservative campaign of 2019.
So let me tell you a few things about trains. They might seem like they haven't changed much over the decades, but let me tell you, when you catch a glimpse of a modern train, you're looking at an incredibly efficient, computerized masterpiece of transportation technology. Our sponsor, CN, is at the cutting edge of the railroad industry, constantly pushing to make its locomotives and cars more fuel efficient, greener, yes, I said greener, and far safer than the trains your mom and dad watched from their car windows. CN trains, like modern cars, have what amounts to a high-tech nervous system that monitors speed, proximity to other trains and objects, even whether the train is entering a work zone. It will initiate braking independently. CN locomotives are far more fuel efficient than they were even 20 years ago, with a smaller carbon footprint, and so much safer. Sensors equipped with artificial intelligence along CN tracks are constantly monitoring train wheels for overheating or flaws. Sensors on board the trains constantly inspect the tracks. Ultrasound technology examines the interior of CN's rails. Ground-penetrating radar assesses the ground underneath them. It all combines to get CN cargo to its destination on time and safely. There is no form of overland shipping as efficient and clean as rail. And through its pending merger with Kansas City Southern Railway, CN means to connect the continent. Its network will stretch from coast to coast in Canada, down through 18 states and deep into Mexico. The first truly North American railway, headquartered in Montreal.
Hamish, when did you start working on the campaign? When did you get appointed? First of all, what is your title and what do they call you in the Conservative Party?
I was the National Campaign Manager.
National Campaign Manager. And that is the top position on the rung? Are there chairs over top of you?
We did have a campaign chair who served as sort of an advisory role. But in terms of the day-to-day decisions, I was at the top of the campaign structure.
Okay, so National Campaign Manager, when did you assume that role?
In October of 2017.
October of 2017. So 2 years in advance.
Yep, basically exactly 2 years.
Of Election Day.
Yep.
You put together a team of people. I gather, I don't know because I'm not an insider, but I gather it didn't include a lot of people who'd worked on the Harper campaigns.
No, it included a lot of people who worked on Harper campaigns. It didn't include a lot of people who perhaps had worked on the last Harper campaign, but it included a lot of people who'd worked on the 06 and the 08 campaigns and who'd been around in a lot of provincial politics. As you know, when you're in power for a decade, the people cycle through. People come in and work in politics for 2, 3, 4 years, and then go off and end up in the private sector or do something else or move to a different part of the country. So it was there were a lot of people who'd worked on Harper campaigns.
I'm interested in how the team came together because I have such a different experience. Like the Paul Martin thing, a bunch of people got together in like 1989
right.
to work on his first leadership campaign and basically stayed together and grew and matured as political operatives and campaigners over the course of the succeeding decade and then moved seamlessly, well, depending on your perspective, seamlessly into the 2004 election campaign. You didn't have a group of people you'd moved through the party with like that, did you?
Well, I mean, there was people that I had done politics with and people, friends of mine who I'd been on politics with who certainly came through, but there was no sort of there's nothing like there was no 20-year long-standing Team Scheer kind of group. So really, it was a combination of finding people who had worked on all over the country on different campaigns, who had been involved in a lot of the Harper stuff. In some cases, at the top level earlier, or in some cases a little bit later in the Harper years, in more mid-level positions, and some of those people taking leadership roles in the campaign. But I mean, you correctly point to it. You know, putting together the team it was in many ways the biggest challenge. And the thing that surprising to me, I'm sort of a numbers person. I didn't think of myself as a people person. That I took the most satisfaction for when I look back on the campaign, it was the assembling the team and mentoring some of the younger people. That's what I most fondly remember of the campaign. which is not what I would have predicted at all. So we had people there was people who had been involved in Mr. Scheer's leadership. There had been people who had been involved in the leadership of other contenders who we went out and said, wow, that person did a great job and really gave us a run for the money in the leadership. Let's get them on board. There was people who'd been involved in provincial campaigns. A lot of people who'd come out from, who'd been involved in Jason Kenney's campaign. There was a huge chunk of Albertans who had come out. There'd been quite a few people who'd been involved in provincial politics here in Ontario. I think I counted at one point, we had people in the war room from every single province, which I think was necessary and good.
Right.
We had one person from the north. It probably would be nice to have more, but we had one Yukoner. And really went and found those people from all over. And as you know, it's also difficult to pick together a team because you're getting people to sort of have to take 6 weeks or 2 months out of their life, and not everyone can do that. So there were certainly people that we had invited to join the campaign team who ultimately couldn't make the time commitment and blow up their lives like that.
Right, because it's not even 6 weeks or 2 months. Anybody in a serious position was giving a lot of time for the full 2-year period.
Absolutely, right? Like our management team was meeting weekly well over a year before the campaign started, and then was daily by the spring, right? So at that point, some people had other jobs and were outside of the system, but others were, you had to.
You were all in.
Yeah, absolutely.
Did you have as much money as you would have liked to have had?
Yes.
Right.
I mean, there's two functions on money, right? There's the campaign writ budget, which is limited by Elections
I presume you
Canada.
were fully funded in the
Yeah,
writ.
of course. It was $29.8 million. It was great because it was supposed to be $28.9 million. It was supposed to be $28.2 million, and then Elections Canada revised it about 2 weeks in, and we had an extra $700,000, which was phenomenal. And then we had lots of money pre-writ. Never had an issue with money. The bigger problem was the Liberals' pre-writ spending rules that let us only spend a maximum of $2,046,800 on advertising in the 10 weeks before the campaign started.
Right.
And that had an impact on when we could spend the money. So we ended up doing a significant ad buy in the spring, in May into early June, and then another one in the late part of that pre-writ period. But that timing was not necessarily what we would have chosen if we could have spent the money anytime we wanted.
Were you happy with what those ads did for you, those Scheer introductory ads?
I was very happy with the ones in the spring. The one of there's two sets. There was one of Mr. Scheer in his neighborhood he grew up in, talking about what he was doing, and then there was ones in Quebec with some of the members of the team.
Yeah, those
ones were good. Those were better than the ones we ran in August. And in retrospect, I think I should have just kept not bothered with new creative and just kept that creative running. Right. So I think those ones were better. I was happy with those. The ones in August were okay, but I think I liked the ones from the spring better in retrospect.
Right. Let's go back to December of last year. Let's go back to a year ago.
Sure.
Before SNC-Lavalin. What was the operating theory as to how you were going to win the election before SNC-Lavalin happened?
Well, we were in a very unusual situation in that people really, really liked, and this continued right through the election, people generally really liked or really didn't like Mr. Trudeau. He's an extraordinarily polarizing figure, and that has a lot of impact. And he's not a normal politician. Maybe he's evolving that way now after being in power for 4 years and will continue to. But in certainly in the first few years, he was not a normal politician in the way that Canadians reacted to him, and the way that when bad things happened to him or his government made mistakes, they reacted to that. Most politicians, as you know, if they come in, they start out, if they win an election, they're reasonably popular, and over time it kind of chips down. You know, Premier Wynne is a good example of that. She was obviously popular when she won in 2014 and was a general plus for the party, and by 2018 was not. No. Whereas
I thought we were talking about the Conservatives.
Sure,
today,
no,
okay?
but I'm just getting. No, but this. I'm not picking on Wynne out of malice. It's just an easy example. Whereas with Trudeau, so I always describe most politicians the way it works. It's like a dimmer switch. They're popular, and then slowly over time they kind of become less popular. And in people's minds, they like someone like, that's probably pretty good. Then over time, I don't know about that. I don't know about that, and you end up kind of not liking them. But it's a slow process. With Trudeau, it's a light switch. People really like him until one day they don't. And once they decide they really don't like him, they're voting for us. NDPers and Greens generally don't hate Trudeau. They don't love him, but they're kind of okay with him. If you really dislike Justin Trudeau, you're voting Conservative almost uniformly. But it's very unusual. It's a light switch. So what we realized is that if we were telling people Justin Trudeau is awful in the way a normal opposition would do things, that what we realized was that people didn't buy it. Like they just didn't buy it. They thought, well, no, I really like him. So what we did is we spent 2018 talking about failures. And we didn't talk about why there was failures. So we'd say he failed on this, he failed on this project, he failed to balance the budget, everything else. So we weren't saying Justin Trudeau's a bad man. We weren't saying Justin Trudeau has poor judgment or Justin Trudeau is a bad prime minister. Because if we said that, people would say, no, I think he's great. And they're not convinced by it. So we talked about failures because it was a way of chipping away at his brand without assigning that kind of blame. Because if people start saying, well, he's failing at everything, then they start reflecting in their own mind, well, maybe there's a reason for that. And we can start filling in what that reason is later. So we really spent, and I think we had a great deal of success by the end of the year. The media were talking about a lot of the failures the government had over the time. If you look at the polls in 2018, and if you can't take all the Nanos ones as independent because each Nanos is a tracking poll. So if you take 1 in 4 Nanos polls, which is the separate thing, and you average all the polls for 2018, we ended up basically being tied or within half a point of the two parties. So we knew we had a chance to severely damage them. We knew there was that the government had a whole bunch of weaknesses. We knew that people were beginning to feel disappointed, and the voters were beginning to feel disappointed in Mr. Trudeau. They weren't convinced that it was because he was bad, but they were beginning to see that perhaps he's not quite what they expected to be, and that a lot of the things he was touching weren't working out. And the India trip was, for certain people, emblematic of that, and a lack of seriousness. But that was only part of it.
Right. So if SNC-Lavalin hadn't happened, you're saying the critique would have been more about the basic ability of the government to deliver on what it was saying, rather than its ethics and values.
Yes.
Right.
And I actually believe that on the whole,
would that still have been a better campaign? Maybe thinking back on it.
Yeah. I mean, I think that I was generally of the view that SNC-Lavalin was a big distraction for us, and a big distraction for the government. Obviously, it was a big distraction for the government, but it was a big distraction for us about an issue that didn't really resonate in a way that what people didn't like about the SNC-Lavalin scandal wasn't particular aspects of what Mr. Trudeau did or didn't do. It was the way that the scandal was completely mishandled from issues management perspective. And by the spring of 2019, the government looked like it was in chaos.
Right.
And people didn't like chaos. They're like, well, hold on.
So nobody understood the issue really,
No
or
one
had a
understood.
strong point of view. It just looked like the government was a mess.
And they massively mishandled how to deal with that over the course of February through April. And by sort of late April, they began to figure it out, and they were able to successfully turn the page. But those 2.5 months or whatever it was, it looked like chaos, and Canadians are not in favor of chaos in their federal government. They're like, these guys, these jokers, I'm not really a big fan of that. But nobody understood the issue. I mean, everybody was sort of high dudgeon about the Shaw Cross doctrine. You know, my father's a lawyer, my father-in-law is a lawyer, my wife's a lawyer. I'd never heard of the Shaw Cross doctrine until everybody was in the Globe and Mail was writing, verklempt editorials about how awful it was being violated. Great, I'm sure it's awful and bad, but it doesn't impact anybody's daily life in any meaningful way. So my concern was we would, and we did, and we were right to, as an opposition, invest an awful lot of effort into SNC and to keep that chaos narrative going, and that chaos narrative certainly lasted until it didn't, until they were able to stop the chaos at some point in the spring. So it certainly did some damage in terms of confidence, and that people didn't like that chaos. But I don't believe it in and of itself had a huge impact on the voters. And we saw that when new revelations came out in August and new revelations came out right at the beginning of the campaign. A one-day story, everybody moved on, had no impact on the vote whatsoever.
Right. So on the day of the writ, how did you imagine things would unfold?
I thought that for the campaign, we would spend 4 weeks battling away, more or less being tied. We knew, the public polling had us behind going into the campaign. We were 5 or 6 points behind sort of in late August. I knew we would very, very, very quickly close that gap, and we would be effectively tied 1 point ahead, 1 point behind, whatever, within the first week of the campaign, which is what happened. And then I knew we would basically battle it out, being maybe at best 1 or 2 points ahead or a point behind or something for about, for a few weeks. And then at some point, if everything went according to plan and people were looking for a change, we would start to pull away in the last 5 or 6.
But it wasn't a
10 days.
Natural change election. It's only been 4 years.
No,
right?
it wasn't. I don't know.
So it is really. It's not like it's 10 or 12 years where the incumbent party has to rebut the desire for change.
Absolutely.
You had to create a desire for change prematurely in the public. And what did you think was the wedge that was going to do that?
Affordability.
Okay.
We invested an awful lot on affordability. All the research showed, both public, you can see it in the public research and our own internal research showed that affordability, cost of living, not having enough money, a whole just a general insecurity about income really existed, particularly in the GTA and the Greater Vancouver area. And it was a frustration that people were doing everything right, that you're working a job, your spouse is working a good job, you've done everything you're supposed to, you went to university, you got degrees, you got good jobs, you bought yourself a house in the suburb, you're doing everything you were told as a kid you should do, you got a couple of kids, and at the end of the month, you've got $97 more than you had at the end of last month. Right?
Right.
And, God forbid your roof gets a leak.
It's the political issue of our time.
Right. Agreed.
Everywhere in the world.
Absolutely.
Right? In the Western world, anyway.
Yeah.
So my question to you would be, Hamish, is that both you and the Liberals tried to talk about that issue in different ways.
Yep.
I would argue that you both tried to talk about it in what I would call small ball, targeted, relatively small initiatives that were targeted at specific segments of the electorate for their repeal, whether it was your income tax credits or whether it was Trudeau's camping subsidies. But nobody put a really, really big idea on the table. And I have this belief that these kinds of targeted small initiatives can be successful in an election that isn't about anything. But if the election becomes about something, they can get swamped. Those like if the election's about change, for example, then those initiatives don't really counteract that.
Totally.
Did you consider putting something bigger on the table to really focus the election around it?
Yeah. Well, look, first of all, I disagree with. We didn't actually have very many tax credits. We had a universal tax cut that would have lowered the lowest income tax rate, which would have impacted everybody who pays income tax.
Yeah.
Which would have saved
in scale about the same as what the Liberals were proposing.
Well, the Liberals came out with a couple of days after ours.
Yeah, but sure,
I don't think that's a coincidence. And our research showed that was interesting. And to your point, that of the stuff we announced, that was the thing that people glommed onto and connected the most with.
Right.
And that was good. We had built some other packages specifically. We wanted to do something specifically for seniors, so we were going to increase the age credit. Because I don't think I went to a meeting with candidates for 2 years where I didn't get someone saying, we have to do something for seniors. Everywhere I go, what are we doing for seniors? So we did, increasing the age credit for seniors. We could have chosen to do that more or less, but we wanted to make the universal tax credit a big enough number. $850 for a family we hoped was an eye-catching enough number. And then we did some other things that allow us to talk about education. So, for instance, boosting the RESP matching. Which is a way of talking about education, how important it is, was also good. So, look, I think we at various points certainly had discussions about, should we just make this universal tax cut even bigger and pour a bunch of all this other money in there. Ultimately, we decided that we wanted to have things we could talk about throughout the campaign, and we wanted to have announceables every day, and we wanted to build a narrative over time that would appeal to people at different stages of life. And they weren't micro-targeted tax cuts just at people, or tax credits at very, very specific things. They were deliberately broad. So we did do some. Obviously, we did the transit tax credit, which applies to everybody who buys a Metro Pass in the city and passes. So that's that's pretty broad. And we had things like the kids activity credit, which was a very, very popular credit in the Harper days. And that was one of those things that with the feedback we got from caucus overwhelmingly was when they were door knocking was people kept on saying, that's the one thing I really miss that Trudeau took away. So it was an opportunity to bring that back. But yeah, I certainly post-campaign have thought several times, should we have had, instead of having this batch of things, should we have had maybe make that universal tax credit, maybe it was $2,000 a family and not $850, or maybe that would have been more eye-catching and more instantly understandable. Who knows? Hard to say, but certainly it was. Yeah, it's one of those doubts you have.
You made two decisions. I'm thinking about the Ontario wing of the campaign specifically, and I was pretty much that's all I watched.
Sure.
Through the campaign. Because I had a theory that you couldn't win the election unless you won Ontario. Right. So I was just looking to what is happening in Ontario, what are people doing in Ontario. So there were two decisions that I thought were really interesting with regard to Ontario. One is the decision not to have Doug Ford play any role in Ontario, which I wholeheartedly endorsed as based on my knowledge of the Ontario electorate as a smart thing for you to do. You got a lot of blowback about it nonetheless. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, Mr. Ford said he wasn't going to get involved in the campaign, and we respected that decision.
Surely he would have accepted a request.
I don't know. We never, after he said he wasn't interested in campaigning, we didn't push him on that.
Right.
I don't think we got a lot of blowback for that.
Okay. You got a lot of blowback from me on this podcast about climate.
Sure.
Right? And I was consistently critical of, I didn't understand why, let me just take a step back. I've done a lot of public opinion research about climate change. I know two things about it. One of which is that people are increasingly concerned about it.
Yeah.
And second of all, that they don't really know what would work to fix it.
Right.
And certainly aren't necessarily intuitively drawing a link between a carbon tax and solving climate change globally. So I knew those two things. And so I fully expected that you would come up with what would look to the public like a rigorous climate plan, even if it didn't meet what the scientists said was required to do and didn't have a carbon price in it. But that you would be able to say to Canadians that you had a climate plan that was as good as anybody else's, and they wouldn't know the difference, and then you could fight on the tax.
Right.
So you deliberately did not give yourselves that fig leaf. Why is that?
I disagree. Our real plan on the environment, which we released in June, is probably the most comprehensive climate plan an opposition party's ever released. It was extraordinarily detailed. What it didn't have is it didn't have year-by-year carbon reduction targets, which I would point out that that Justin Trudeau's campaign plan in 2015 didn't have any of those either. Right. In fact, their entire climate plan in 2015 was, we will put a price on carbon. That was the entire thing, if you go back and look at their platform.
4 years has been a long time on the climate file, though.
Sure, no, I don't disagree, and that's why we put out a 70-page document with a lot of detailed policies about how we could reduce global climate change, which is ultimately the task. I mean, Canada, as you know, Canada could turn off its entire economy tomorrow, and China would fill up those emissions in 3 weeks. Right. So we had a very, very detailed policy.
But no third-party endorsement. Like it wasn't good enough that anybody else besides you would say it was good enough.
Sure. But we weren't expecting any NGOs to come out and endorse the conservative climate plan. We could have gone and said we'll do Paris times 5, and we wouldn't have gotten an endorsement from anybody in that sector. But it also comes down to the fact that the voters who are most concerned about that kind of the voters that we needed. To your point, we wanted to say we did something, and we were doing something, and we had a plan to focus on technology, not on taxes. Which, let's face it, the technology over the last couple hundred years is the only way that we escaped our Malthusian trap and everything else, right? Ultimately, all this will come down to technology. But our voters, the voters that we needed, were were not particularly fussed about the details. They wanted us to say something, and we said something. The interesting thing, and this is the fundamental. It's a question not just for me in this campaign, but it's a question that I think Conservatives have to look at broadly, whether it's at provincial or all federal levels, is that one of the reasons we lost in the end was that NDP and Green voters, many whom were very concerned about climate, switched to Liberals to stop us at the end. And there's only a very, very small percentage of NDP Green Liberal switchers who are open to voting for us. And the question is, could we have done anything to give them, to not be scary enough to them, perhaps on the climate file, while still motivating our base to come out? And that is a big fundamental question, and I think every Conservative has to figure out going forward. That on the climate file, because I will say what our own research has shown is that the people who were most interested and most focused on the climate were voters who considered voting NDP or considered voting Green, but particularly in Ontario, switched to the Liberals in the end. They were most concerned about climate in a way that Tory Liberal switchers were much, much, much less concerned about it.
Right. I made a comment. I made the inference that you were deliberately counter-programming when you announced the road expansion program, highway expansion program, the day of the climate march. Was I right that you were deliberately counter-programming?
No, it was on the schedule. It was a little bit.
You must have noticed it.
Yeah, of course. obviously noticed it, but there was no reason to change it, and it wasn't. And we wanted to take a good opportunity to. We also knew it wasn't so much deliberate camera programming, but we knew we wanted to get an infrastructure announcements to cut through, and we knew that because all the other leaders were doing the same thing, that the news coverage would just be all of them leaped in with their own one thing. So it would be, Trudeau, Singh, May, they were all at climate marches, so it's going to be leaders goes to climate marches, and then our stories would be completely separate. Right. So that was deliberate. It wasn't necessarily, if they'd all done another thing, we would have looked for the same opportunity. So it wasn't necessarily quite so cheeky. You
seem to me like somebody whose conservatism is steeped in intellectual thought. If I put this proposition to you, which is that there's nothing about the conservative philosophy that would tolerate climate change, or nothing about the conservative philosophy that would lead people to not be environmentalists or to try to preserve the climate, that the Conservative Party's opposition to climate action is in defense of a regional industry, not in defense of conservative ideology. What would you say to that?
I would say that the Conservative Party's opposition to some climate actions are a reaction to poor policy. I'm from British Columbia. We've seen a carbon tax that has not had an impact on. It's been great for general revenues, but has not had an impact on reducing the amount of carbon generated. The fact of the matter is that if we're going to do anything to reduce the amount of carbon dioxide going into the atmosphere, we need to. I believe fundamentally it will come from better technology and finding ways to encourage that better technology to be developed, as opposed.
But conservatives say the pricing mechanism leads to the development of the technology.
Well, that's one way of doing it, but the fact of the matter is that it hasn't. And this is the big intellectual lie that Trudeau and many others have pushed, which is that in order to have the mechanism to be high enough, for the pain point to be high enough to change behavior in a carbon tax has to be vastly higher than what it is right now.
Absolutely.
And it's not me saying that. No, it's everybody. I mean, this UN people said it's $300 a ton. People say $100. I'm not a climate policy expert, but I know it's a lot more than where it is currently and where they're saying it's going to go. So our approach...
I thought that was going to be a big part of your campaign.
We talked... Well, the problem is that the carbon tax isn't universal across the country, and it certainly was in Ontario. But we but whenever we say that, people say, well, I guess they're doing something, or to some point, and we say, well, we've got a plan. Look, our plan was saying that we're gonna push large emitters into investing into things to invest in technology to reduce carbon output, which ultimately is where I think it's going to be. I agree that my objection to carbon taxes is it's just bad policy that doesn't work, and it makes governments richer in a way that doesn't actually have a positive impact on the climate. So that's why I reject it as a conservative, as opposed to and I think.
And do you believe that the Trudeau carbon tax is a government tax grab, despite their talk of rebates?
Well, we saw it. We saw it in their own numbers came out in June, which showed that the rebates were smaller than they had promised, and that the rebates, in some ways, it's income redistribution. Like the way the rebates will work is, if you have 2 cars and live in the suburbs and you've got to drive 12 kilometers to work and 8 kilometers for the kids to school, the rebate you're going to be net negative, and the realistic ability of somebody like that to change their life to make it low carbon is actually fairly limited. Whereas if you live in an apartment downtown and take the TTC once a day, you're going to make money on the rebate, and you're already living a reasonably, comparatively low carbon lifestyle.
Right.
So it ends up in a situation where people are you're actually not going to have an impact, and people who can't do much about it are going to end up paying more, and the people who have already not necessarily out of a choice because of the environment, but a choice because of where they are in life and their lifestyle choices are going to be better off because of it.
I generally agree with you about that, although there are more F-150s in Saskatchewan than there are farmers. But
sure, well, culture obviously plays a big impact. And the number one selling vehicle in Quebec is an F-150 as well, which is interesting.
So let's get back to the campaign. I want to talk to you about your advertising in the writ itself. What did you want it to do for you?
So we wanted to do 2 things. One was we wanted to remind people of things they didn't like about Mr. Trudeau, and educate them about the things that we were going to do as a government. So put an emphasis on the good news in our platform, the universal tax cut, and other things we were doing. So what we realized is that there was, to your earlier point about time for change. So our fundamental realization was there's 2 groups of people we needed to win the election. For us to get a majority, we needed 2 groups of people. One was people who didn't like Justin Trudeau, or were kind of done with him, or disappointed in him, who had probably been Tory voters at some point in the past, maybe really regular ones, and we just needed to get them back. And all we really had to do with them was remind them that what they didn't like about Justin Trudeau, and we were going to be fine with them. The next group of people were people who were disappointed in Trudeau, but they didn't dislike him strongly. They didn't really love him, but they didn't really dislike him. And they had a generally positive view of us. They weren't scared of Tories sort of just as a brand, but they had to be convinced that we would do better. That, okay, yeah, Trudeau's been kind of disappointing. He hasn't been that great. He's been okay. But are you guys really going to be any better? And that goes to that change point of view. They didn't have a strong desire for change, but if they could be convinced, and we knew the first group would get us to maybe almost or tied with the Liberals in popular vote, but in order to get the majority, we needed that second group. So our advertising was based around reminding those people who didn't like Trudeau why they didn't like him to get out and vote, and that we were the answer to that. And then also a big chunk of it was more positive around our platform, associating our leader with some of the positive things in the platform.
The 4 boxes.
The 4 boxes, right? So that people would realize, oh, actually, if the Tories get in, if Scheer gets in, that's pretty good for me. That's pretty good for my kids. That's going to be great for my aging parents, and see how life would be better with us.
Yeah. What was your mix of digital versus TV radio?
It skewed TV radio. I think it was, when we look at it all, probably it worked out to about 65% TV radio, 35% digital. The difference, though, is
I bet the Liberals will say they put a lot more into digital. What do you think about that?
Well, the difference is that the digital was all in the target seats. We didn't spend a penny in digital outside of target seats. So if you lived in a target seat, which was, roughly 100 ridings, if you lived in a target seat, your experience would have been probably something like 55% of your experience would have been digital advertising, because the ability to target like that.
Okay. Do you think TV is still a useful medium?
Yes.
Okay, why?
Because I just look at where people get their news, and we did it in pre-election polls and we did it in post-election polls. And amongst the swing voters that we needed, there's definitely a skew towards to a huge chunk of people still get it from television and still watch TV.
It's also the only way to tell anybody a story about anything.
Yeah.
Right. We talked on the panel here. We had a advertising panel that looked at the party's advertising throughout. One of the things we thought about the Conservative advertising was that it lacked the emotional content. Was that it was very rational,
right,
and didn't try to grab people emotionally. Is that deliberate?
Well, at the end, for the last 10 or 12 days of the campaign, we had an ad that was very, very emotional, that was in very high rotation, that showed Mr. Scheer meeting with Canadians across the country and talking about why we needed a government that would do better for Canadians. It was an extremely emotional ad that was probably, I think back to the mix, probably the single ad that in English Canada we had of any one of our individual ads probably had the biggest individual buy.
Okay.
But that really only kicked in the last, after the debates anyway. So maybe you're right. Maybe we should have started some of that stuff earlier for sure. That's certainly a valid, a very, very valid point. But yeah, no, that ad was very, I don't know if you saw it, but it had sort of talked about millions of Canadians, and it was very sort of inspirational. It made the point that how we were going to do better and why it was important for everybody, and it was very emotional.
What's the process inside your campaign about getting an ad done? Do you have an agency or do you do it in-house?
Yep. So we had an agency who have worked on a lot of, they've done some federal work before, but they've done a lot of provincial work, especially in Western Canada, from BC Liberals to Manitoba and everywhere in between. And so we basically sat down with them, and I think similar to whatever else, we said, here's the voters we need. Here's what they care about. Here we need the voters who are going to believe that we will do better for them, the life will be better for them. Here's what we're putting in the platform. And let's go get some concepts and look at a whole variety of concepts.
And then you take them into focus groups?
No.
No?
No, I never focus group. I personally don't believe in focus group advertising.
Okay, so how do you decide what's going to work and what's going to go in the air?
We'll do a little bit. It depends on the timelines. We have a broad group of people we consult with, people who've worked in politics for a long time, and look at what the consensus is amongst them. And then on some advertising, we will do online small group, small testing, where we show people a batch of advertising, so the ad that we're running plus a couple of other random commercials for things, and then run different versions and then ask questions and seeing what statistically is moving people's views of our candidate or the Prime Minister or the parties or whatever else.
Why don't you believe in focus testing ads?
Because I believe that everybody wants to be a critic. People are there, they're getting paid $75 for 2 hours to watch a bunch of ads, and they feel like they want to give value. So they're like, well, their guys are paying me and they gave me a sandwich. I guess I'd better say something. And so they end up becoming film critics.
Yeah.
And I think you can tell ads that they're the most focus grouped ads are ones that have all the edges rounded off, and it just becomes this sort of weird consensus. And I generally believe that in general, focus groups, the first 10 or 15 minutes of a focus group is the most valuable before, as you know from focus groups, it's only so long before groupthink sets in and dominant personalities.
You have to really, really know how to read what you're hearing,
right,
and to sort through all that stuff you're
right,
talking about and find out, is anything actually changing their mind in there?
So I've sat through a lot of focus groups for advertising, and I have never been convinced that for the amount of money you spend, because if you do a lot, it gets really expensive. I've never been convinced that it's for the value money you're spending, it's good value. And I'd rather do things like show the ad to 700 people online or send one version to 350 people and one to another 350 people and see if it has an impact on their views of leaders or issues or whatever.
Right. Okay, interesting. So, where were you when you heard about blackface?
Which time?
The very first time you heard that there was a picture of Trudeau in blackface?
Well, I'd known about blackface since much earlier in the year.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Tell me about that.
Well, so I'd heard about blackface. That there was pictures of Trudeau in blackface probably last fall sometime. I can't remember exactly when. And spent a lot of time looking for them. I knew that there was at least 3 separate pictures. I had a friend of mine who had seen a picture on someone's fridge, and we spent a lot of time trying to get a hold of those pictures. And as Mr. Scheer said during the campaign, the video of Mr. Trudeau in blackface at the river rafting thing, we had provided to Global News for verification. So we had had that video for some time before Time magazine broke the story. And Time broke it. So I knew Time was going to break that story about 4 or 5 hours before it did that afternoon.
Did you expect it to be fatal?
No.
Why not?
Because I don't think I think I expect it to be a massive distraction, but I don't believe that Canadians instinctively believe that Justin Trudeau is a racist. I think they might have believed he'd done some stupid things when he was younger, and perhaps wasn't the person he was saying he was. But my biggest concern when the Time thing broke was that it was too early, because I believed it gave him time to solve the problem. Whereas that had come out 5 or 6 days or 10 days before Election Day, I think that would have been much more difficult. Mm-hmm. I also think the order in which they came out had a big impact. The pictures from the yearbook, grainy and black and white, were in the context of a costume party, and therefore it seemed a little more excusable. Whereas the video, and video is much more emotionally evocative than a grainy black and white picture. The video, without the context of a Christmas party, or it wasn't a Christmas party, it was a fundraiser of some sort. Without the context of a costume party, would have been much more damaging. So I think if the order of those things even been the same day, if the order had been different, I think it would have had more of an impact.
Right. That's interesting. Scott Reed argues on this podcast that there's something special about Trudeau's brand or persona that allows him to survive things like this. Do you think that's right?
Absolutely.
What is it?
Look, I think people genuinely like him. He's a likable guy. He's a charismatic man. Like, right, he and a huge chunk of the electorate, although smaller than it once was, is willing to say, I like this guy. I believe he believes what he's saying, and they interact. They connect with him more as a celebrity than as a politician, right? And that's been, I think, a huge part of his success, and continues.
Politics is drifting generally more towards celebrity. Did you find that you were running an everyman in an era of celebrity politics? That's
an interesting question. I don't know. I don't know that politics is moving towards. I think obviously there's some big exception. I think, look, Trudeau was a political celebrity. He became famous because of his father, and because he's charismatic, good-looking guy. But it wasn't. It's different than in the United States or in Ukraine, where TV stars are winning elections. And I can't think of a Canadian TV star that would go into politics tomorrow and be able to walk away with an election. But maybe I'm naive.
Well, I thought the Ontario Liberals should have gone for Rick Mercer.
Well, that would have been a very interesting choice.
Yeah,
that would be extra. I'd pay to watch that. I'd pay to watch that.
Andrew Scheer said when he was running for the leadership that he was Stephen Harper with a smile. By the time the first debate came along, he looked like Stephen Harper with a snarl. What happened to the friendly Scheer persona?
He was. That's an interesting way of putting it. He is certainly a genuinely very friendly and outgoing and smiley person. I think somewhere along the way, there was he was a serious business running for prime minister, and a prime minister should be serious. So I think he became more serious over the course of the campaign, or over the course of the summer and into the campaign, and his what he once described at the press gallery dinner as his resting pleasant face became a little less smiley, because there were times when perhaps the resting pleasant face wasn't as entirely appropriate, when he was dealing with some serious important issue, and he would sort of be grinning there as well. So I think he I can't speak to his facial muscles, but I think he took the view that as prime minister, being prime minister is a serious business, and I should look like I'm serious.
There's a strong school of thought that conservative politicians who are happy and positive, a la Reagan, are more palatable to people than conservative politicians who are sort of angry. And
Sure. Or Boris Johnson, to your point.
Right.
Very much a happy warrior.
Yeah.
Oh, I generally tend to agree with that. It's one of the reasons I supported Andrew for the leadership.
So what was the thinking then behind the opener of the English debate? By which
Right.
I mean, listen.
Sure.
I am the author probably of the strangest debate statement by a leader, other than in the league with that one, most unorthodox, most unexpected debate statement by a leader, Paul Martin, 2006, about the notwithstanding clause. So
Right.
I understand sometimes you say, holy God, we've got to try to shake something up here.
Right.
So what were you trying to do with that
Well,
opening
I think that's
statement?
part of it. I think it was shake something up. And the feeling was that, Trudeau, especially coming out of the TVA debate, which is another whole point, but coming out of the TVA debate, the feeling was that Trudeau had really skated through that debate, that the other leaders had sort of focused their time on beating each other up, and Trudeau was almost to some extent a bystander in the TVA debate, which was to Trudeau's advantage because he's the incumbent, and if people are are looking at the other groups fighting amongst themselves,
Absolutely.
People aren't landing blows on him. So we wanted to come out early and land some serious punches and show that that Andrew had the chops to take him on and hold him to account for the failures of the government, and to set the tone for the debate. And it was fascinating, the impact on Mr. Trudeau's body language. And the other thing we wanted to do was we realized that the number of people who were going to watch the whole debate was very, very, very small. And it was about getting the clips and about getting the stories. So we knew that
You wanted a clean clip.
right, and we wanted, but it's not just the clips; it was also the stories. We knew that the writing, the web writing, and the print writing, that every one of these journalists were sitting there with an open Word file, writing it, and they were going to write it in the order things happened in. Because their editors were saying, you've got to get something on the web in the first 20 minutes or first impressions of the debate.
Okay.
So if we gave them a defining thing right up front, we knew that was going to be the top of every story, and that for the rest of, no matter if something interesting happens an hour and a half in, it's going further down.
Right.
Because we looked at the TVA coverage and realized the TVA coverage was defined by the first 20 minutes. And while there was lots of interesting things that happened at the end of the TVA debate, they didn't get nearly the coverage. So we sort of looked at this and said, the way it's set up, and the way that we can define this message and land that the blow on Trudeau, and hopefully knock him off his game. And I think if you look at his body language through the rest of the debate, he didn't perform. The Prime Minister didn't perform particularly well for the rest of that debate. I don't think he had any big flaws, but he certainly wasn't on his game in the way that he was later in the French debate, in the commissioned French debate later, or in the TVA debate, or other performances. And it's
So you think you discombobulated him?
Absolutely, and I'll tell you this. So right before the debate, there was a green room with all the leaders in them, and each were allowed to bring in one staff member. So I went in. I was walked in the room with Mr. Scheer, and the Prime Minister, it was us. There's 10 of us. There's each of the leaders, 6. I guess there's 12 of us. There's a handler and each of the leaders. And Mr. Trudeau was keyed up. He was energy. He was sort of bouncing around the balls of his feet like a boxer, which obviously he does. And he was keyed up. And I thought, oh wow! Like I walked out of that room when they took the leaders upstairs to the thing. I walked out there going, wow, the Prime Minister is going to bring it tonight. Like he's energized, he's fired up. He was kind of doing a thing with his hands where he's like a little sort of boxer thing. Like he was fired up. And I just never saw that energy. The energy I'd seen in the green room 15 minutes before the debate, I never saw it the rest of the campaign after Mr. Scheer landed that.
Interesting. Okay. The bio stuff. You knew about blackface. Did you know about the dual citizenship?
Yes, of course.
And did you know about the insurance broker thing?
Well, the insurance broker thing, Mr. Scheer never described himself as a licensed insurance broker. He was, for the first step of the accreditation, worked in a broker's office. That's an example of, I think, we didn't have it flagged as a problem. And I think because it seemed like such a small semantic difference, we did not handle that issue as quickly or as well as we ought to have, certainly.
Okay, so you obviously, having known about the dual citizenship, sometime over the last 2 years, you must have considered putting it out there.
Yeah.
And?
You're
just kind of hoping nobody would find out?
No, once Mr. Scheer decided that he was going to renounce it, that was the decision that was made, and we said, okay, well, if it comes out, the answer will be turns out a very complicated process, but we would be able to say, well, no, he's taken the steps to renounce it, and he won't be an American citizen. Whenever, I'm not up to date on that.
Doesn't sound like you thought it was a big deal.
No, it actually turned out to be. I was concerned about it. I certainly thought it was going to be a big deal. Actually, I think in retrospect, it was less of a big deal than I thought it was. That I thought it was going to be. But once, and I especially think if Mr. Scheer had said, "I'm not going to renounce it," I think that would have been a huge deal.
Yeah.
But once he made the decision to renounce it, and more importantly, once that process was underway and he'd filled out, like, it's a multi-step thing. You don't just kind of send an email to the U.S. government saying, "Hey, I'm not a citizen anymore." It's an involved process. Once that process was underway, and he had basically filled out, he'd done the first series of steps. We said, well, this is something that, if anybody asks, yeah, it's absolutely.
So, but what would have been the downside of just taking it off the table in 2018? Just saying, listen, I had dual citizenship. I don't want it anymore. I want to be the Prime Minister of Canada.
Yeah, I mean that's a good question that since the election I've thought about many times.
Okay.
I don't have. Ultimately, we decided that since he was getting rid of it, maybe it will. If it comes out, we'll just say, well, he's getting rid of it, and would I have liked the process to have been done earlier? So when we got a question,
it was done, yeah,
and we said, yeah, absolutely, he renounced it 3 months ago. That would have been lovely, right? But
so I want to talk to you about polling.
Yeah.
Tell me everything I say that's wrong.
Okay.
My understanding is that the Central Campaign was communicating to Conservatives in the last week, in the days leading up to the election, that a win was certain, a majority was possible, and the floor was about 140 seats.
That's wrong.
That's wrong?
Yeah.
Okay. What did you believe in the last week?
I believe in the last week that we could get about 20 seats ahead of the Liberals. But there was certainly lots of scenarios where they got more than us. I certainly, one of my big regrets in the campaign was I think we did and I take full responsibility for all of it, but I take responsibility for, I don't think we managed expectations well. I think we managed expectations poorly. And people got very excited, and I've got some other thoughts on that. But and the big thing that happened is that, and we see it in the public polling, and we can see it in our post-election work, is that we really lost, particularly the last 3 days of the campaign, particularly in Ontario, which broke against us. And when I compare the polling we have for our final round of polling, which was 4 days before Election Day, because as you know, there's lots of people saying, why aren't you going to poll right up to Election Day? Because knowing what the result's going to be is not valuable. You want to be able to, you poll to make decisions. Right? And so the final set of data, which I guess was 4 days out.
Yeah, we stopped polling with a week to go in the Ontario provincial campaign to divert that money into operations.
Right, yeah. So our last poll was 4 days out before Election Day. And there were a couple of concerning things in there, but our vote in all regions was well within margin of where we thought we were going to be, what we ended up being with where we thought we were going to be. The difference was that Liberal turnout was higher and that the NDP and Green vote ended up being lower, and the Liberal vote profited from that.
What were you seeing in Ontario that no public polls were saying? I just need to say to you what I've said publicly. In fairness to you, I need to say to you what I've been saying publicly, which is that I never saw a public poll that showed you leading in Ontario. The polling companies that tend to lean toward the Conservative Party, like Ipsos and Angus Reid, showed it tied.
Sure.
And the polling companies that tend to lean more toward the Liberal side of things, the Ecoses, et cetera, showed a 7 or 8 point Liberal lead in Ontario. But I never saw anybody say there was a Conservative lead in Ontario.
Yeah, I don't believe there was ever a Conservative lead in Ontario.
So then how were you going to win the election?
Well, by that point, as I said, I thought we could get, we could get 20 seats on a good day ahead of them. We weren't in contention for a majority. Obviously, we need to be ahead in Ontario if we're going to win a majority. But certainly by that point in the campaign, that was not on the table. What we could see, there was two things that happened. One, we could see that in a chunk of our target seats, there was no chance. There was a chunk more that was still very much in play. And what had been happening is that we had been seeing a increase in enthusiasm for voting. So when we asked people, how likely are you to vote on a scale from 0 to 10, Conservative voters were significantly more likely to say 10 out of 10 than Liberal voters in Ontario, and that had been growing.
But Jesus, man, projecting turnout is such a mug's game. Holy God.
But then what happened is the advanced polls turned out. And what happened when we looked at the advanced polls and we actually ran the data through who had voted is, yes, we'd done a good job of pushing our people to the advanced polls as we always do, but the other parties do that as well. But we had found that more of our voters, like there was an enthusiasm for our vote that was better than expected. The advanced polls were better than we expected in terms of our voters coming out. So we believed we could see that. And then in the final poll that we got, the one we did 4 days before Election Day, Liberal enthusiasm had tied the Liberals had closed the enthusiasm gap. And it was that final data point, that was the first time we went, oh, this is going to be a big problem.
Do you think that was possibly aided by Mr. Scheer talking about the prospect of a Conservative majority government?
Well, that is a big part of it. I mean, possibly. Look, we always knew from the beginning that the Liberals would want to make the last week of the campaign, post-debates, a choice by saying, this is what a Tory government is going to look like.
This is the playbook. We do it every time.
Absolutely, right. So what we did is we said, that's coming anyway. Like, no matter what we say, that's coming anyway. Right. So we're advertising the last two sets of ads in English Canada were about what a Tory versus Liberal government would look like. There was quite a negative one, and then there was the more inspirational, emotional one talking about what government. So we leaned into the fact saying this is the choice between governments, right? If they're going to spend all the time saying a Tory government can happen, and we're going to persuade people that this Tory government's not going to be scary. And that the other thing that happened was that Mr. Singh had talked about a coalition, and we knew that a coalition, talk of a Liberal NDP coalition, was good for us for two reasons. One is it drove a certain segment of blue Liberals to us to stop. The idea of Liberals supported by the NDP is terrifying to them. So that and a significant chunk of the Liberal vote in Ontario was scared of that, and an even larger chunk of Liberal vote. People who had said, well, I'm not really so keen about Trudeau, but I guess I'll vote for them because I hate the Tories, were willing to go and vote NDP or Green because they were able to then vote for the party they actually wanted to support and still have those values in government. Right? So what we started talking about was saying the choice is between a Conservative government and a coalition government. An NDP Green coalition, and we rolled out new branding, and there was a whole bunch of online advertising about the coalition you can't afford. in the last 10 days. Mr. Trudeau, of course, came out and said that there's a real chance of the Conservatives winning in order to scare that back. One of the things that hurt us in this situation—
The squeeze play on the NDP doesn't work if the Conservatives aren't a threat to win.
Right.
Which is why Mr. Scheer accentuating that he did have a chance to win.
But I don't know how him running around and with the expectations in our party, if he was running around saying, I don't really think we got a chance to win, I'm just hoping we can pick up 25 more seats,
Sometimes you got to come in under the wire.
No,
in 2004, I came to the conclusion when people thought that Harper was going to win, they were voting for us. And when people thought that we were going to win, they started voting for Harper.
Sure.
And we had to come in under the wire.
Sure. No, right? I get that. I get that.
Under the radar, I mean.
And this goes to my expectations management point that if we'd started coming out saying, well, I think Trudeau could win again and we don't really have a chance, the blowback internally in the party and the membership and the candidates would have been insane, and maybe we didn't. We could have handled that better, certainly. But we knew that. But we also knew that even if Mr. Scheer never talked about the chances of him winning, we knew the Liberals were going to be talking about that nonstop. So let's lean in and talk about it in a positive way. It was made more difficult by the fact that Mr. Singh, after musing about a coalition, 36 hours later kind of walked that back.
So I'm going to ask you a question, which for potential litigation reasons, I will not ask a follow-up to or comment on in any way. But I don't think this interview can go by without me asking. You talked about the last 3 days in Ontario and what went down, right? Part of the reason you lost the last 3 days in Ontario was because Mr. Scheer spent the whole time answering questions about Warren Kinsella, right? What the fuck was going on with that?
Well, we don't discuss who we do not do business with.
Right. Well, okay, so how did you feel that how would you wish you'd done those 3 days?
That's a good question. Talking about that less would have been nice. I think reiterating, maybe to the point of our earlier conversation a couple of minutes ago, reiterating less about us being in government and more about the continued dangers of Trudeau being in government, and raising the prospect of the downsides of him winning a lot. Maybe that would have worked better. But I think at that point, I think that could have worked better. But I also really struggle with what we could have done to make NDPers and Greens less scared of us than their moderate dislike of Trudeau and the Liberals. And this goes to a big fundamental problem the Conservatives has, particularly in Ontario. There's been 12 elections this century, federal and provincial elections in Ontario. Conservatives have won a majority of seats in 2 of those, in 2011 federally and 2018.
It's not a small C Conservative province.
Right.
Especially in the urban areas.
Right. And, when 2011 federally and 2018 provincially. And in both cases, the NDP have been in second place. And if Conservatives can only win in Ontario when the NDP is
when the Liberals are dead, basically.
When the Liberals are basically dead, or the Liberals are so unpopular that NDPers hate them more than they hate the prospect of the Tories, that's a fundamentally big problem we have as a party and a movement that we have to change or figure out what that looks like going into the future. I'm not going to sit here and say I know what the answer is, but I know it's a problem, and if we ignore the problem and just hope that what we've always done will work, it's not going to work.
What was the most impressive thing you saw the Liberal campaign do? What did they do that you said, hey, that was good?
What did I do? They did a few things that I liked. I think, what did they do that I really liked? I thought Trudeau's performance in the French debates was, I think, very, very good. I think from a campaign perspective, they and I have no idea what they also figured out blackface faster than I thought they would. The evidence during the SNC debacle was that they really were doing a very, very poor job at issues management through that time, and they could have I have no doubt that Jean Chrétien would have made SNC a week-long story, not a 9-week-long story. And so when Trudeau's first press conference on the plane after blackface was not particularly good, but his one the next day in Winnipeg was very good.
Yeah.
And I thought, wow, they put that to bed faster than I expected them to. And they did a very, very good job of that. And that goes to my point that I always knew they would figure it out, how to deal with blackface. But more time was their friend on that, right? So that was the moment when they did that I thought, oh, they've really upped their game.
You going to do another one of these, Hamish?
I have absolutely no interest in doing that.
Really? No. Come on, you're too young. It's too in your blood.
I have a very young family and some very, very understanding business partners, and I have no desire to go and blow my life up like this again for another few years.
Right, for another few years until the right person comes along. Yeah.
Who knows what happens? Who knows what I'll do in my 50s? But at the moment, it's inconceivable.
Yeah. Well, listen, thank you so much for coming on here to talk about the campaign. I've been in that seat, and I know that it's not fun. But I also know that to get where you did, you've done a tremendous number of things right. So, thank you, Hamish Marshall, for coming in and having such an honest conversation with us about what is, for those of us who run campaigns, a very difficult subject. And I really appreciate it. Thank you.